The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Robert Chen's penthouse office. At 55, he had everything money could buy: a successful real estate empire, properties spanning 3 continents, and a lifestyle that most people only dreamed of. Yet, as he stood gazing out of his floor-to-ceiling windows at the bustling city below, an inexplicable emptiness gnawed at his heart. 20 years had passed since he'd last seen his daughter, Grace. The thought of her still brought a sharp pain to his chest. She would be 25 now, but the image frozen in his mind was of a bright-eyed 5-year-old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. That was before his wife, Diana, had disappeared with her one night, leaving nothing but a hastily written note: "We can't live like this anymore." Robert had spent millions trying to find them over the years, hiring the best private investigators money could buy. But Diana had been clever, covering their tracks perfectly. Eventually, he'd been forced to accept that they didn't want to be found. The pain had hardened him, driving him to build his empire higher, as if success could fill the void they'd left behind. That morning started like any other, with Robert reviewing property acquisitions and development plans. His assistant brought in his usual black coffee and the day's schedule, but there was something different in her expression. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "there's someone in the lobby asking to see you. She says she's your daughter." Robert's hand froze midway to his coffee cup. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Over the years, there had been dozens of young women claiming to be Grace, all hoping for a piece of his fortune. Each false hope had cut deeper than the last. "Send her away," he said automatically, his voice rough. But his assistant lingered. "Sir, she's not asking for money. She just wants 5 minutes of your time. And..." She paused. "She has your mother's locket. The gold one with the ruby heart." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. That locket had been a family heirloom, passed down through generations. He'd given it to Diana on their first anniversary, and she'd always promised it would go to Grace. It was never mentioned in any media coverage about him or his family. No imposter could know about it. With trembling fingers, Robert pulled up the security camera feed from the lobby. There, sitting on one of the leather chairs, was a young woman in worn-out clothes, her dark hair unwashed and tangled. She looked thin, too thin, and her shoulders were hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. But even through the grainy footage, he could see Diana's eyes looking back at him. "Send her up," he whispered, his voice barely audible. As he waited for the elevator to bring her to his floor, memories flooded back: Grace's first steps, her laughter as he pushed her on the swings, the way she'd curl up in his lap during thunderstorms. What had happened to transform that happy child into the desperate-looking young woman in his lobby? The elevator dinged, and Robert's heart hammered against his ribs. Footsteps approached his office, each one echoing like thunder in his ears. Then his door opened, and time seemed to stop. The young woman stood in the doorway, clutching a small bag to her chest. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her clothes hung loose on her frame. But it was her face that made his knees weak. Despite the hardship evident in every line of her appearance, she was unmistakably his daughter. "Dad?" Her voice cracked on that single syllable, and the locket dangled from her trembling fingers, the same locket he'd last seen around Diana's neck 2 decades ago. Robert took an unsteady step forward, then another. 1,000 questions crowded his mind. Where had she been? What had happened to her? Where was Diana? But as he looked at his daughter's face, seeing both the stranger she'd become and the child she'd been, only one thing mattered. "Grace," he breathed, and opened his arms. She hesitated for just a moment before rushing into them, and as he held his daughter for the first time in 20 years, Robert Chen, the man who owned half the city, finally felt rich. The next few hours passed in a blur of emotions and carefully chosen words. Robert had his assistant cancel all appointments for the day and ordered food to be brought up, watching with a mixture of joy and concern as Grace devoured the simple sandwich as if she hadn't eaten in days. Perhaps she hadn't. They sat in his private conference room, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but Robert couldn't take his eyes off his daughter. Every movement, every gesture seemed precious, 2 decades of absence compressed into these moments. "Where have you been living?" he asked gently, noting how she kept glancing around the luxurious room as if she couldn't quite believe she was there. Grace's fingers tightened around her paper cup of tea. "Here and there," she said quietly. "Mostly shelters lately." "Mom." Her voice caught slightly. "Mom died 3 years ago." Robert felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Despite everything, he had never wished Diana harm. "What happened?" he managed to ask. "Cancer," Grace replied, her eyes filling with tears. "It happened so fast. We couldn't afford proper treatment. She was gone within months." The words, "couldn't afford," echoed in Robert's mind like a cruel joke. He had billions, yet his wife had died penniless, and his daughter had ended up homeless. The magnitude of the tragedy threatened to overwhelm him. "But why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "After your mother, why wait 3 years?" Grace's face clouded with a mix of shame and hesitation. "Mom made me promise not to contact you unless I had no other choice. She told me stories about you, about why we left. But recently, I met someone who used to work for you. They told me a different version of events. That's when I started to question everything I thought I knew." Robert leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What did Diana tell you?" Grace looked down at her hands. "She said you were controlling, obsessed with your business empire. That you had dangerous business partners who threatened us. That we had to disappear to stay safe." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But that wasn't true, was it?" Robert felt the old anger and hurt rising up, but he pushed it down. Now wasn't the time. "No," he said softly. "It wasn't true. I loved you both more than anything. The business was only ever meant to give us a better life. When you disappeared..." He had to stop for a moment to collect himself. "I searched everywhere. Hired private investigators, offered rewards. I never stopped looking." Tears were flowing freely down Grace's cheeks now. "I remember being happy," she whispered. "Before we left. I remember you teaching me to ride my bike in the park, and making pancakes on Sunday mornings. With chocolate chips shaped into smiley faces," Robert added, his own vision blurring. "You wouldn't eat them any other way." A small laugh escaped Grace, though it sounded more like a sob. "Mom never made them like that. I used to ask, but she'd get upset whenever I mentioned anything about our life before." Robert wanted to reach out and hold her again, but he sensed she wasn't finished. There was something else weighing on her, something beyond their painful past. "Dad," she began, then stopped, twisting the hem of her worn sweater. "There's something else you need to know. The real reason I finally came to find you." She took a deep breath, seeming to gather her courage. "Mom wasn't just sick. Before she died, she told me something. Something about why we really left." Robert felt his chest tighten. After 20 years, was he finally going to learn the truth? She was scared, Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not of you, but of herself. She had been embezzling money from your company. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. She was gambling, Dad. She had debts she couldn't pay back. When she thought you were about to discover what she'd done, she panicked. She took me and ran, making up the story about you being dangerous to justify it to herself, and to me." The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. All these years, he'd tortured himself trying to understand what he'd done wrong, how he'd failed as a husband and father. The annual audits after Diana left had shown some discrepancies, but nothing that had seemed significant at the time. He'd been too devastated by their disappearance to dig deeper. The night before she died, Grace continued, her voice breaking, she made me promise to find you someday and tell you the truth. She said she couldn't die with this sin on her conscience. She wanted you to know she was sorry, not just for the money, but for taking me away from you. For letting her addiction destroy our family. Robert sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of 2 decades of misunderstandings and lost opportunities. His mind was spinning with questions. How different would their lives have been if Diana had just come to him for help? If she'd trusted him enough to confess her addiction? Could he have saved her? But looking at his daughter's face, so much like her mother's, yet carrying the visible scars of their harsh life, he knew that dwelling on the past wouldn't help either of them now. What mattered was the future, and the chance they had to rebuild what was lost. Grace, he said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. Thank you for telling me this. For being brave enough to come here. Whatever happened in the past, whatever your mother did or didn't do, none of that changes how much I love you. How much I've missed you. Will you give me a chance to be your father again? The hope and fear in his voice were raw, unmasked. This was Robert Chen not as the powerful businessman, but as a father reaching out to his lost child, offering his heart with no guarantees it wouldn't be broken again. Grace's answer came in the form of a tight squeeze of his hand and a tearful smile that, for just a moment, transformed her back into that 5-year-old girl he'd never stopped loving. I'd like that, Dad, she whispered. I'd like that very much. The transition from homeless shelters to living in Robert's penthouse apartment was overwhelming for Grace. Her small bag of belongings looked out of place in the luxuriously furnished guest room that was now hers. The bed was softer than anything she'd slept on in years, and the walk-in closet was bigger than some of the rooms she'd stayed in at various shelters. That first night, she couldn't sleep. The silence was too complete, the comfort too foreign. She found herself sitting by the window, watching the city lights twinkle below, wondering if this was all a dream she'd wake up from. The door creaked open softly, and Robert appeared with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. I thought you might be awake, he said, offering her one of the mugs. I couldn't sleep either. He'd changed from his business suit into casual clothes, making him look more like the father in her childhood memories. Everything feels so surreal, Grace admitted, warming her hands around the mug. This morning I was trying to figure out where my next meal would come from, and now. She gestured at the opulent room. Robert sat down beside her, his face reflecting the gentle glow of the city lights. I've been thinking, he said carefully. About what your mother did, about the gambling. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I wish she had come to me for help. There were programs, specialists, we could have faced it together. Grace took a sip of her hot chocolate, letting the warm sweetness comfort her. She was ashamed, I think. The more it spiraled, the harder it became for her to admit the truth. After we left, she tried to stop many times, but she trailed off, remembering the cycle of hope and disappointment that had marked their years together. What was life like? Robert asked softly. After you left? Grace stared into her mug, watching the marshmallows slowly melt. We moved around a lot. Mom would get jobs, try to start over, but the gambling always found her again. We'd have good months where she'd save money, promise things would be different. Then she'd relapse, and we'd have to run before debt collectors found us. I changed schools so many times I stopped trying to make friends. Robert's hands tightened around his mug. You should have been in college, building a future, not running from city to city. I did graduate high school, Grace said, a hint of pride in her voice. Got my diploma through a night school program while working at a diner. Mom was clean then, for almost a year. She was so proud. Her voice caught. That was her longest stretch without gambling. But then she got sick, and everything fell apart again. Robert set his mug down and turned to face his daughter. "Grace, I need you to know something. Your future, whatever you want it to be, starts now. College, career, anything. You'll have all the support you need." Grace felt tears welling up again. "I always dreamed of becoming a counselor," she admitted. "Helping people with addictions, families like ours. But I never thought it would be possible." "It's more than possible," Robert assured her. "But first, we need to take care of you. I've arranged for a doctor's appointment tomorrow, and a shopping trip with my assistant if you're comfortable with that." Small steps. Grace nodded, overwhelmed by his kindness but also feeling a gnawing anxiety. "Dad, what if people ask questions? About where I've been, about Mom? Your business partners, the press?" Robert's expression grew serious. "Let me worry about that. You don't owe anyone explanations. Our story is ours to tell, if and when we choose to tell it." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the city below. Then Grace spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "I found some of Mom's old journals after she died. She wrote about you often, especially near the end. About how much she regretted what she'd done, how she wished she could turn back time." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn notebook. "I think you should have this." Robert accepted the journal with trembling hands. "Thank you," he whispered. "This means more than you know." As dawn began to paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges, father and daughter sat together, bridging 20 years of absence with small stories and shared memories. Grace told him about the odd jobs she'd worked, waitressing, cleaning offices, anything to survive. Robert shared stories of his own struggles. Of building his business while never giving up hope of finding them. "You know what I remember most clearly?" Grace said suddenly. "The day before we left. You were teaching me to write my name in Chinese characters. You said our name meant morning, and that it was a good name because every morning brings new beginnings." Robert's eyes widened in surprise. "You remember that?" Grace nodded. "I practiced writing it whenever I missed you, which was often. Mom didn't like it, but I never forgot." Robert stood up and went to his study, returning with a piece of paper and a brush pen. With careful strokes, he wrote their family name. He said softly, "Chen. Morning." Grace took the brush with slightly shaky hands and, slowly but surely, reproduced the character beside his. Their two versions sat side by side, one strong and assured, the other slightly wobbly but clear in its intent. "A new morning," Robert said, looking at their shared name. "That's what this is for us." As the sun rose fully over the city, Grace finally felt sleep tugging at her. But before heading to bed, she had one more question. "Dad? That employee you mentioned, the one who told you the truth about everything, who was it?" Robert smiled mysteriously. "Let's save that story for tomorrow. You need rest, and it's quite a tale in itself." As Grace finally drifted off to sleep in her new bed, she held on to the piece of paper with their shared writing. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Hope for a future she never thought possible, hope for healing the wounds of the past, and hope for the new morning that was just beginning. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the distant sound of traffic below. For a moment, panic gripped her, the unfamiliar surroundings triggering her instinct to run. Then she remembered, she was home. After 20 years, she was finally home. In the kitchen, she found Robert already dressed for work, cooking breakfast. The sight was so wonderfully normal that it made her throat tight. He looked up and smiled, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the counter. "I wasn't sure what you like for breakfast nowadays," he said apologetically. "But you used to love my eggs." Grace took a bite and closed her eyes. "They taste exactly the same," she said softly. You still put a tiny bit of cheese in them." As they ate, Robert seemed preoccupied, occasionally checking his phone. Finally, he set it down and looked at her seriously. "About the person who helped us find each other, she's actually coming to the office today. Would you like to meet her?" Grace's heart jumped. This mysterious person had changed her life, had given her the courage to seek out her father. "Yes," she said immediately. "I want to thank them." An hour later, Grace found herself back in her father's office building, wearing new clothes that Robert's assistant had brought over. Early that morning, she felt strange in the expensive outfit, like she was playing dress-up, but Robert had insisted she deserved to feel comfortable in her new life. They waited in Robert's office, Grace fidgeting with her sleeve until a knock came at the door. Robert's assistant entered, followed by an elderly woman who walked with a slight limp and carried herself with quiet dignity. Grace didn't recognize her, but Robert stood immediately, his face softening with respect. "Grace," he said gently, "this is Mrs. Wu. She was our housekeeper when you were little." Grace's mind raced back to fragments of childhood memories, warm cookies after school, gentle hands braiding her hair, a soft voice singing Chinese lullabies. "Auntie Lin," she whispered, using the affectionate name she'd called her as a child. Mrs. Wu's eyes filled with tears. "My sweet girl," she said, opening her arms. Grace rushed into them, inhaling the familiar scent of jasmine that instantly transported her back to her childhood. As they sat down, Mrs. Wu explained how she had never stopped thinking about Grace and Diana over the years. She had retired from working for Robert but kept in touch with her network of friends in the Chinese community across different cities. It was through this network that she first heard rumors of a young homeless woman who looked remarkably like Diana Chen. "I couldn't be sure it was you," Mrs. Wu said, holding Grace's hand. "But when I heard you were asking questions about Robert Chen at a shelter in Chinatown, I knew. I made sure word got back to you about your father, about the truth of what happened. You were the one who told the shelter volunteer to mention Dad's business partner story to me?" Grace asked, pieces falling into place. Mrs. Wu nodded. "I knew you needed to hear the truth from someone else first. Your mother's stories had shaped your view for so long. But I also knew you had your father's strength in you. Once you knew the truth, you would find your way home." Robert cleared his throat, clearly emotional. "Mrs. Wu came to me last week, told me she thought she'd found you. She's the reason I was prepared when you walked into the lobby yesterday." Grace turned to Mrs. Wu, overwhelmed with gratitude. "But why? After all these years, why did you keep looking?" The elderly woman's eyes were wise and kind. "Because love doesn't stop just because people leave. I loved you like my own granddaughter. And I watched your father's heart break every day for 20 years. Some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for." Mrs. Wu reached into her bag and pulled out an old photo album. "I kept these all these years, hoping someday." She opened it to reveal photographs Grace had never seen, herself as a toddler in the garden with her father, birthday parties, ordinary moments of a happy family life. As they looked through the album together, Mrs. Wu shared stories that filled in the gaps in Grace's memories. She spoke of how Robert had never given up hope, how he had kept Grace's room exactly as she'd left it for years, unable to bear changing anything. "Your father built his empire," Mrs. Wu said softly, "but he would have traded it all just to know you were safe and happy." Robert, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Mrs. Wu has been my conscience all these years. When I wanted to give up searching, she wouldn't let me. When I threw myself into work to numb the pain, she reminded me what really mattered. And now," Mrs. Wu said, smiling at them both, "my work is done. You found each other again. The rest is up to you." Grace impulsively hugged the older woman again. "Thank you," she whispered. "For never giving up on us." As Mrs. Wu prepared to leave, she turned to Grace one last time. "Your mother made mistakes, yes. But she loved you very much. Remember her for that love, not for her failures. After she left, Grace and Robert sat in comfortable silence, looking through the photo album together. Each picture was a piece of their shared history, a reminder of the love that had survived 20 years of separation. "Dad?" Grace said finally. I think Mom would be happy about this. About us finding each other again." Robert nodded slowly. "I think so too. Whatever happened between us, Diana would want you to be happy, to have the life you deserve." Looking at a photo of her younger self, perched on her father's shoulders and laughing without a care in the world, Grace felt something settle in her heart. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of possibilities. And thanks to one elderly housekeeper who never stopped believing in the power of love and family, she had been given a second chance at the life she should have had all along. As the morning sun filled the office with golden light, Grace realized that this wasn't just a new beginning for her, it was a new beginning for all of them. Even Mrs. Wu, who had carried the weight of their family's separation for so long, could finally find peace in knowing that her faith and persistence had helped heal 2 decades of hurt. The mystery of who had helped reunite them had been solved, but in many ways, their story was just beginning. The news of Grace Chen's return spread through the city's elite circles like wildfire. Despite Robert's efforts to keep things quiet, the sudden appearance of a long-lost daughter was too juicy a story to stay hidden. Whispers and speculation followed Grace everywhere she went, but she was learning to hold her head high, just as her father had taught her. 1 month after her return, Grace stood in front of her bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing herself. Regular meals and proper care had brought color back to her cheeks. Her new haircut framed her face softly, and the designer clothes she wore, while still feeling foreign, fit her perfectly. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. They held hope now, and a quiet confidence that grew stronger each day. "The car's here," Robert called from the hallway. Today was important, Grace's first public appearance at the Chen Foundation's annual charity gala. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her navy blue evening gown, and stepped out. Robert's face lit up when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Just like your mother at your age." Then, noticing her nervous expression, he added, "We don't have to do this if you're not ready." Grace straightened her shoulders. "No, I want to. These charities help people like I used to be. It matters." The drive to the venue was quiet, both lost in their thoughts. Grace watched the city lights blur past, remembering how differently she used to see these same streets. A month ago, she'd been searching for shelter beds and free meals. Now she was heading to a gala where single tickets cost thousands of dollars. The red carpet leading to the hotel's grand ballroom was lined with photographers. Robert squeezed her hand as they stepped out of the car. "Remember," he whispered, "you have nothing to prove to anyone. You're my daughter, that's all that matters." Camera flashes exploded around them as they walked in. Grace heard the whispers, saw the curious stares, but she focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Inside, the ballroom was a sea of designer gowns and tuxedos, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over everything. "Robert. There you are." A woman in her 60s approached them, dripping in diamonds. "And this must be Grace. I'm Helen Wong, an old friend of your father's." Grace shook her hand, remembering what Robert had taught her about social etiquette. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Wong." "Such wonderful manners," Helen said, but her eyes were sharp with curiosity. "We've all been dying to hear where you've been all these years. Such a mystery." Before Grace could respond, Robert smoothly intervened. "Grace is focusing on the future now, Helen. Speaking of which, I heard your foundation is doing remarkable work with youth education." As Helen launched into a description of her latest charitable project, Grace felt a wave of gratitude for her father's protection. He'd been like this since her return, proud to acknowledge her as his daughter but fierce in defending her privacy. Throughout the evening, Grace met dozens of people, each interaction a delicate dance of polite conversation while avoiding personal revelations. Some, like Helen, were obviously fishing for gossip. Others seemed genuinely warm, especially those who remembered her as a child. During dinner, Grace was seated next to a young doctor who introduced himself as Dr. James Liu. Unlike the others, he didn't ask about her past or make subtle digs about her sudden reappearance. Instead, he talked about his work at a free clinic in Chinatown. "Actually," he said, "we could use volunteers. People who understand what it's like to struggle, who can connect with patients who might be hesitant to seek help." Grace felt her heart skip a beat. "I've been thinking about doing something like that," she admitted. "Using my experiences to help others." "Your perspective would be invaluable," Dr. Liu said earnestly. "Especially with our addiction support programs." Later that evening, Grace found herself on the venue's terrace, taking a moment to breathe. The city stretched out before her, the same view she'd had from countless streets and shelters, but now she was seeing it from above, from a position of privilege and possibility. Robert joined her, loosening his bow tie. "You did wonderfully tonight," he said. "I saw you talking with Dr. Liu." Grace turned to her father, excitement bubbling up. "He told me about volunteer opportunities at his clinic. Dad, I think this could be my first step toward becoming a counselor. A way to make something meaningful out of everything that happened." Robert's eyes shone with pride. "I'll have my foundation double their funding," he said immediately. "They do good work there." "No," Grace said firmly, surprising herself with her conviction. "I mean, yes, they need funding, but I want to earn this on my own. I want to help because of who I am, not because of our name or money." Robert was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "You sound just like me at your age. Always determined to prove yourself." He paused, then added, "Your mother would be proud of you, you know. Despite everything that happened, she raised a daughter with a strong heart." Grace felt tears threatening to spill. "Sometimes I feel guilty," she confessed. "Being here, having all this, when she died with nothing. Enjoying this new life when she never got to make things right." Robert pulled her into a hug, not caring about the expensive dress or perfectly styled hair. "Your mother's mistakes don't define your future," he said softly. "The best way to honor her memory is to live fully, to help others like you want to do. To break the cycle." Over her father's shoulder, Grace watched the party continuing inside, the glittering dresses, the flowing champagne, the easy laughter. A world away from the life she'd known, yet here she was, straddling both realities. Perhaps that was her purpose, to be a bridge between these two worlds, to use her unique perspective to make a difference. "There will be more events like this," Robert said, following her gaze. "More people wanting to know our story. But we'll face it together, one day at a time." Grace nodded, feeling stronger. The whispers and stares didn't matter. What mattered was what she would do with this second chance she'd been given. Her mother's journals, filled with regret and lost opportunities, had taught her that life was too precious to waste on fear and shame. As they returned to the party, Grace held her head high. She was Grace Chen, daughter of Robert Chen, but she was also the woman who had survived homelessness, who had held her mother's hand as she died. Who understood both privilege and poverty. Her story wasn't a scandal to be whispered about, it was a testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the healing power of love. And this was just the beginning. The free clinic in Chinatown was a world away from the glittering charity galas and corporate boardrooms. Grace sat in the small break room, organizing pamphlets about addiction recovery programs while the sounds of the busy clinic filtered through the thin walls. It had been 2 months since she started volunteering, and for the first time since returning to her father's world, she felt truly useful. "Those need to go in the front waiting area," Dr. Liu said, popping his head in. He looked tired but smiled warmly. "We've got a full house today." Grace gathered the pamphlets, following him into the crowded waiting room. The faces there were familiar, not because she knew them personally, but because she recognized their struggles. The young mother trying to keep her children quiet, the elderly man counting change for his prescription, the teenage girl with shadows under her eyes that spoke of nights spent awake worrying. As she arranged the pamphlets in their holder, a woman caught her eye. She was perhaps in her 50s, with trembling hands and the too bright gaze that Grace remembered all too well from her mother's gambling days. Their eyes met, and Grace saw the shame there, the desperate need to hide. "Excuse me," the woman said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The gambling support group. Is it really free?" Grace's heart squeezed. "Completely free," she assured her. "No questions asked. Would you like me to tell you more about it?" The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, no relation, but the coincidence wasn't lost on Grace, slowly opened up. Her story was painfully familiar, a small habit that grew into an addiction, hidden from family, debts piling up. Grace listened without judgment, sharing pieces of her own story when appropriate. "My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 2 years," Mrs. Chen admitted, wiping her eyes. "She doesn't understand why I can't just stop." "My mother struggled with gambling too," Grace said gently. "I know how hard it is, on both sides. But you're here now, taking the first step. That matters." By the end of their conversation, Mrs. Chen had signed up for the support group and accepted a referral to an addiction counselor. As she left, she hugged Grace tightly. "Thank you for not looking at me like I'm worthless." Dr. Liu had watched the interaction from across the room. When Mrs. Chen left, he approached Grace. "You have a gift," he said. "You connect with people in a way that all my medical training couldn't teach." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Over the past 2 months, she'd grown to admire Dr. Liu's dedication to his patients and his quiet compassion. He treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were homeless or wealthy donors. "I've been thinking," he said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "We're starting a new program, specifically for families affected by gambling addiction. Would you be interested in taking a more active role? Maybe share your story with the groups?" Grace's heart raced at the possibility. "You think I'm ready for that?" "More than ready. Your experience, your understanding, it could help so many people." He paused, then added more softly, "But only if you feel comfortable sharing. I know your privacy is important." That evening, Grace sat in her father's study, watching him work. The wall behind his desk was covered in framed newspaper articles about his business successes, but lately, he'd added personal touches, the photo album Mrs. Wu had given them, Grace's first attempt at Chinese calligraphy, even a finger painting she'd made as a child that he'd kept all these years. "Dad," she said finally. "Can I ask your advice about something?" Robert immediately set aside his work, giving her his full attention, something that still amazed Grace after all the stories she'd heard about powerful businessmen who never had time for their families. She told him about Mrs. Chen, about Dr. Liu's proposal. "I want to help," she said. "But it means being more public about our story. About Mom." Robert was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You know," he said finally, "I spent 20 years trying to protect our privacy, hiding the pain of losing you and your mother. But maybe it's time for both of us to stop hiding." "What do you mean?" "The Chen Foundation has always focused on business development, education, traditional charitable causes. But what if we started a new initiative? Something focused on addiction support, family reunification, second chances?" Grace sat up straighter, ideas beginning to form. "We could partner with Dr. Liu's clinic, help them expand their programs. Maybe even open more facilities in other neighborhoods." "Under one condition," Robert said, his eyes twinkling. "You run it. Not as my daughter, but as someone who understands both sides of the story. Who's lived it? Grace felt tears forming. You'd trust me with that? Grace, watching you these past months, how hard you've worked at the clinic, how you've handled the pressure of returning to this life, I've never been prouder. You have your mother's empathy and my determination. It's a powerful combination. Later that night, Grace couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching the city lights, thinking about Mrs. Chen, about her mother, about all the families torn apart by addiction and shame. She thought about Dr. Lu's faith in her, her father's pride, Mrs. Wu's unwavering love that had brought them all back together. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Lu, just finished a late shift. That woman you talked to today? She came back for the evening support group. You made a difference. Grace smiled, typing back a quick thank you. Dr. Lu had become more than just a colleague, he was a friend who saw her for who she was, not for her family name or her past. Sometimes she caught him looking at her in a way that made her heart flutter, but she wasn't ready to explore those feelings yet. Her focus needed to be on healing, on building something meaningful from the ashes of her past. She pulled out her mother's journal, opening to one of the last entries. My greatest regret is not asking for help when I had the chance. Pride and shame are such heavy burdens to carry alone. We don't have to carry them alone anymore, Mom, Grace whispered to the quiet room. Your story, our story, it's going to help others find their way home too. Tomorrow, she would tell Dr. Lu yes. She would start working with her father on the new foundation initiative. She would stand up at support group meetings and share her truth, not as a tragic tale, but as a story of hope and redemption. The past couldn't be changed, but its lessons could light the way forward. And Grace Chen, daughter of a millionaire and a gambling addict, survivor of homelessness and heir to an empire, was ready to be that light for others finding their way through the darkness. 6 months after Grace's return, the Chen Family Recovery Foundation was ready to launch. The top floor of her father's office building had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space, nothing like the cold corporate environments she'd initially feared. Soft colors, comfortable seating, and Chinese art adorned the walls, many pieces selected by Mrs. Wu, who had become an unofficial advisor to the project. Grace stood in her new office, adjusting a framed photo on her desk. It showed her mother holding her as a baby, both of them laughing at something off camera. Rather than hide her mother's story, Grace had chosen to honor it, to show that addiction could touch any family, and that there was no shame in seeking help. Everything ready for tomorrow's opening? Dr. Lu asked from the doorway. He'd taken a part-time position as the foundation's medical director while maintaining his work at the clinic. Their partnership had grown stronger over the months, professionally and personally, though neither had put words to the growing tension between them. I think so, Grace said, smoothing her skirt nervously. Dad's handling the press. Mrs. Chen, the one from the clinic, has agreed to speak about her recovery journey. And we've already got a waiting list for the support groups. You've done something amazing here, Dr. Lu said softly, stepping into the office. Most people in your position would have tried to forget their past, not turn it into something that helps others. Grace turned to face him, struck by the warmth in his eyes. James, she said, using his first name carefully, I couldn't have done any of this without you. Your belief in me, your support. He took a step closer, and for a moment, Grace thought he might finally bridge the gap between them. But a knock at the door had them stepping apart quickly. Sorry to interrupt, Robert said, though his slight smile suggested he wasn't entirely sorry. Grace, there's someone here you need to meet. A teenage girl stood behind him, shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously around the office. This is Lily, Robert explained. Mrs. Wu's granddaughter recommended her for our peer support program. Grace's heart went out to the girl immediately. She recognized that look of someone carrying too heavy a burden. Thank you, Dad. Dr. Lu, could we continue our discussion later? Once they were alone, Grace gestured to the comfortable chairs by the window rather than the formal desk setup. "Would you like some tea, Lily? My father keeps this office stocked with the best jasmine tea in the city." Slowly, over steaming cups of tea, Lily's story emerged. Her father had a gambling addiction, had recently lost their family's savings. Her mother was talking about divorce. Lily was trying to hold everything together, her grades slipping as she worked part-time to help with bills. "I used to hate him," Lily admitted, staring into her tea. "But sometimes I see him crying when he thinks no one's watching. He's trying to stop, but addiction isn't that simple," Grace finished gently. "Lily, everything you're feeling, the anger, the shame, the love mixed with disappointment, I felt all of that too. Would you like to hear my story?" For the next hour, Grace shared her journey with Lily, not as the polished version she'd prepared for tomorrow's press conference, but as the raw, honest truth of a daughter who'd lived through addiction's impact. When she finished, Lily was crying quietly. "I didn't know anyone else understood," she whispered. "That's why we created this place," Grace said, reaching for a tissue box. "So no one has to feel alone in this struggle again. We have family counseling, support groups, financial advisors, help for every aspect of recovery. Your father's welcome here too, when he's ready." After Lily left, clutching information packets and program schedules, Grace found herself emotional. Dr. Liu appeared with 2 fresh cups of tea, as if sensing she needed support. "That's why I fell in love with you, you know," he said quietly, then froze, realizing what he'd admitted. Grace's heart stopped. "James?" He set the tea down, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd grown so fond of. "I've been trying to find the right moment to tell you. Watching you with your patients at the clinic, seeing you build this foundation, the way you just helped that girl. You could have used your father's money to live an easy life, but instead, you're here, turning your pain into purpose." Grace stood, moving closer to him. I thought maybe I was imagining the way things were changing between us. I've been so focused on getting the foundation started, on healing my own wounds." "I know," he said softly. "That's why I waited. You needed time. We both did. But Grace." He took her hand, and this time there were no interruptions. "I'd like to take you to dinner. A real dinner, not just quick meals between patient visits or foundation meetings." Before Grace could respond, they heard familiar voices in the hallway, Robert and Mrs. Wu, discussing last-minute details for tomorrow's opening. Dr. Liu stepped back, but kept hold of her hand. "Think about it?" he asked. Grace squeezed his hand. "I don't need to think about it. Yes. To dinner, to seeing where this goes." Later that evening, Grace sat with her father in his home office, sharing a late-night snack of dumplings Mrs. Wu had sent over. "You know," Robert said casually, "Dr. Liu reminds me of myself at his age. Dedicated to his work, cares more about helping people than making money." "Dad," Grace groaned, but she was smiling. "Please don't play matchmaker. Things are developing naturally." Robert held up his hands in surrender, but his eyes were twinkling. "I just want you to be happy, Grace. After everything, you deserve happiness." Grace looked around the office, at the photos of their family, old and new. Her mother's journal sat on a shelf, no longer a source of pain but a reminder of why their work mattered. Tomorrow, they would open the foundation's doors, offering hope to families like theirs had once been. "I am happy, Dad," she realized. "Not because everything's perfect, but because everything that happened led us here. Mom's addiction, our separation, all of it, we're making it mean something." Robert reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be so proud of you. So am I." As Grace prepared for bed that night, she thought about Lily, about Dr. Liu, about all the lives that would intersect with theirs through the foundation. Her phone buzzed with a text from James, tomorrow's going to be amazing. Just like you." She smiled, typing back a response, then went to her window, her favorite thinking spot. The city lights twinkled below, but now she saw them differently. In each light, there might be a family struggling with addiction, someone feeling lost and alone. But tomorrow, they would begin offering them a path home, just as she had found her way back. Grace Chen, daughter of a millionaire, survivor of loss, creator of hope, was finally exactly where she was meant to be. 1 year after Grace first walked into her father's office building, the Chen Family Recovery Foundation was celebrating its first anniversary. The conference room was filled with success stories, families reunited, addictions overcome, lives rebuilt. Among them sat Mrs. Chen from the clinic, now 1 year gambling-free, her daughter beside her holding her hand. Lily was there too, her family intact, her father 6 months into his recovery journey. Grace stood at the podium, looking out at the faces before her, some familiar, some new, all part of the extended family they'd built here. Dr. Liu, James now, to everyone, sat in the front row, giving her an encouraging smile. Their relationship had blossomed over the past year, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. 1 year ago, Grace began, her voice steady and strong. "I was homeless, carrying the weight of my mother's struggles and our family's broken past. Today, I stand before you not just as Robert Chen's daughter, but as someone who understands both sides of addiction, the pain it causes and the healing that's possible when we reach out for help." She touched the locket around her neck, her grandmother's ruby heart, now containing a tiny photo of her mother. "My mother's story didn't have the ending we hoped for. But through this foundation, through all of you, her legacy lives on. Every person who walks through our doors carrying shame and leaves with hope, every family that finds their way back to each other, that's my mother's story finding a new ending." Robert sat beside James, tears glistening in his eyes. The past year had transformed him too. He'd become known not just as a business tycoon, but as a humanitarian who understood that true wealth lay in helping others. The press had dubbed them the family that heals families, a title that meant more than any business award. After the ceremony, during the casual reception that followed, Grace found herself in a quiet corner with Mrs. Wu, who had become like a grandmother to her. The elderly woman held Grace's hand, her wise eyes twinkling. "You remember what I told you that first day?" Mrs. Wu asked. "About how love doesn't stop just because people leave. Look around this room, it's full of love that refused to stop, that found its way home." Grace hugged her tightly. "We couldn't have done any of this without you, Auntie Lin. You kept faith when everyone else had given up. And now look at you," Mrs. Wu said proudly. "A successful foundation, a handsome doctor who looks at you like you hung the moon, and most importantly," she tapped Grace's chest, "peace in your heart." The mention of James made Grace smile. Earlier that morning, he'd asked her to move in with him, presenting her with a key to his apartment wrapped in a prescription pad paper that read, "Recommended treatment, sharing our lives. Take daily, forever." She'd said yes immediately. Robert joined them, placing a gentle hand on Mrs. Wu's shoulder. "Would you mind if I stole my daughter for a moment?" He led Grace to his office, now decorated with photos of foundation events alongside his business achievements. But it was a new addition that caught Grace's eye, a framed letter. "I had this framed today," Robert said softly. "It's from Diana's old gambling support group. One of her friends there kept it all these years." Grace read the letter with trembling hands. It was dated just weeks before her mother died. "Dear friends, I may not have much time left, but I want you to know that recovery is possible, even if it comes too late for me. My greatest regret is not seeking help sooner, not trusting that love could be stronger than addiction. To my daughter, who I've burdened with my struggles, I hope someday you'll understand that my mistakes were never your fault. To my husband, who I wronged so deeply, I hope you'll forgive me. And to anyone fighting this battle, don't wait until it's too late to reach out for help. With love and hope. Diana Chen. Grace wiped her eyes, carefully returning the letter to her father. She did understand, in the end. Yes, Robert said quietly. And through you, her understanding is helping others. He paused, then added, I have something else for you. Well, for you and James, actually. He handed her a small box. Inside was a key to a beautiful old building in Chinatown. The clinic where you and James first worked together is getting crowded, Robert explained. I bought the building. It's yours to turn into whatever you think the community needs, a bigger clinic, more foundation space, whatever you decide. Grace hugged her father tightly. Dad, thank you. Just promise me one thing, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When you and James have children someday, tell them their grandmother's whole story, not just the painful parts, but how her struggle led to all of this, to helping so many people. I promise, Grace whispered. The reception was winding down when James found her. He'd removed his tie and rolled up his sleeves, the doctor she'd first met at the clinic showing through the polished foundation director he'd become. Ready to go home? He asked, then smiled. To our home? Grace looked around one last time, at Mrs. Wu sharing wisdom with a group of young volunteers, at her father deep in conversation with Lily's family about education funding, at the wall of photos showing their journey from that first day to now. You know, she said, taking James's hand, a year ago, I thought coming here was the end of my journey. Finding my father, learning the truth about Mom, I thought that was the whole story. But it was just the beginning, wasn't it? James kissed her softly. The best stories always are. As they left the building, the setting sun painted the city in shades of gold. Grace thought about the scared young woman she'd been, standing in the lobby with nothing but a locket and hope. She thought about her mother, who had died thinking she only had a legacy of pain to leave behind. She thought about her father, who had turned his wealth into a force for healing once he understood money wasn't what mattered most. And she thought about love, the kind that never stops, that builds bridges across decades of separation, that turns pain into purpose and mistakes into missions. The kind of love that had brought her home and then shown her how to help others find their way back too. The Chen family story hadn't ended with loss and addiction. It had evolved into something bigger than themselves, a beacon of hope for others walking the path they'd traveled. And as Grace Chen stepped into her future, her father's strength, her mother's empathy, and her own hard-won wisdom lighting the way, she knew that this wasn't the end of the story either. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with promise, purpose, and the kind of love that heals generations.